Welcome, everyone, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the museum. And we are pleased to welcome you to the third installation in our series, Where They Settled, which explores different communities that Holocaust survivors built around the world in the years following liberation. Today's program focuses on Sweden, and I'm honored to welcome and introduce Professor Pontus Rudberg, who will be sharing some of his research with us on this community. And I would also like to thank Sweden's Holocaust Museum for their assistance in this program and for connecting us with Professor Rudberg. Before we begin, I want to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. And they did this at a time when most people were not yet willing to learn about the Holocaust. As a result, many survivors were not yet willing to speak about their experiences. But thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Our museum is currently closed as we complete the final phase of construction for the new Jonah Goldrich campus, which is set to open in June of 2026. During our closure, we're offering a variety of online programs, including Holocaust survivor talks, as well as some in-person programs for those of you in Southern California. So please follow our website for more details. Now I would like to share a little more about our speaker, Professor Pontus Rudberg. He is an associate professor of history and research fellow at Södertörn University in Stockholm. And he has written a few books about Swedish Jews and the Holocaust, Swedish immigration and refugee policy during World War II, as well as Scandinavian Jewish history. He is one of the editors of the series Scandinavian Jewish Studies, and recently guest edited a special issue of Holocaust and Genocide Studies on the Holocaust in the Nordic countries. After today's talk, you will have a chance to ask questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. So I want to thank everyone again so much for joining today, and thank you so much, Professor Rudberg, for leading today's talk with us. And you may begin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming to listen. So I will share my PowerPoint presentation with you here. So in my presentation, I will give a brief overview of a topic that I've worked on for years now. It's a research project that I'm trying to finish up, and I'm writing the book manuscript now. So the project is about the Holocaust survivors who came to Sweden at the end of the war and shortly after, and how they were helped to rehabilitate, trace, and reunite with surviving relatives, if there were any, and to re-immigrate back to their home countries, or to a third country, or to integrate in Sweden for those who chose to stay on. Approximately 12,000 Jewish survivors came to Sweden after the war through two major operations at the very end of the war and shortly after. The first was the Swedish Red Cross mission with the white buses in May 1945. And The second was a joint operation between the Swedish government and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, the UNRRA, in the summer of that same year. So in my project, I look at the whole process from that the survivors were brought over from German concentration camps by the Red Cross and from DP camps in Germany by train from Bergen-Belsen to Lübeck and with specially chartered ferries to Sweden. I look at how and by who they were cared for when they arrived in Sweden, how they were treated, and what kind of care they received, and also how they experienced this themselves. I look at their rehabilitation process, how they were first interned at different arrival centers, how they were registered, bathed, received medical examinations, got new clothes, were sent to either a refugee center or to special hospitals. Many of them were very sick. Many had TB and typhus. And most of the survivors, most came from Eastern Europe. A majority were women, young women. For those who came from Germany or Austria or Scandinavia and Western Europe, most of them, they returned after the war. But those who came from Eastern Europe, that was still occupied by Soviet Union, and they were afraid to return. So they often tried to stay on in Sweden or wanted to emigrate somewhere else. Many of them emigrated to the United States, some to South Africa, Australia, and many of the young, especially young people who did not have any survivors left in their families, choose to emigrate to Palestine, which meant that they before 1948 that they immigrated illegally. And I've also studied the different re-immigration programs and schemes, including these illegal schemes, ship transports. One such ship was called the Ulua, was very similar to the famous Exodus ship, as it brought hundreds of Holocaust survivors from Sweden via Le Havre and the Mediterranean, being chased by the British Navy to the beach in Haifa. But roughly half of the Jewish refugee and survivor population decided to stay in Sweden. So I also look at this group and how they were treated, and with time integrated into Swedish society. So that's what I'll talk about now. But I think first we need a little background information about Sweden and the Swedish Jews. So in 1933, the Jewish population in Sweden was around 7,000, with around 4,000 in the capital, Stockholm. The first Jews had immigrated from mostly Mecklenburg and Hamburg and settled in Sweden in the late 18th century. They were followed by some of their relatives and former neighbors, so it was sort of a chain migration, and later also by a wave of Eastern European Jews. Many came from the Suwalki region in Poland. Around the turn of the century, 1900, another wave of mainly Russian Jews came. So this in this image you see the board chairman of the Jewish community of Stockholm in the 1930s, Gunnar Josefsson, who belonged to one of the old Swedish Jewish families with German Jewish origin. And on the right, Sweden's chief rabbi, Marcus Ehrenpreis, from when he came to Sweden. He came to Sweden from Bulgaria, from Sofia, where he was the chief rabbi before he came. Ehrenpreis had sort of a double background. He was born in Lemberg in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was raised in traditional Jewish. He went to Jewish school. But he was also given a more modern secular education. He went on to study in Germany, both at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums and at the University of Erlangen, where he studied literature. So he had this sort of double background. He became a pioneer in the early Zionist movement. He was Herzl's aide at the First World Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. And in Sweden, he became sort of a bridge between the old Swedish Jewish families and the more newly immigrated Eastern European Jews. Chairman Josefsson on the left was born and raised in Stockholm. He owned the largest bookstore in town. He was a typical representative of the Liberal Party within the community. And the Swedish government was restrictive towards immigration, and especially towards Jewish immigration in the 1930s. Residence visas, which you needed to be able to stay for more than 3 months in Sweden, if you were a foreigner, were very difficult to get. And by 1938, only around 2,000 Jewish refugees had been given temporary residence visas. And this restrictive policy was motivated by a mix of general xenophobia, nationalism, labor market protectionism, and anti-Semitism. So there was this widespread fear among officials and politicians that if the country would admit more Jews, it would give rise to anti-Semitic sentiments among the population. You know, we're not anti-Semites, but if we allow more Jews to come, anti-Semitism might increase. That was the argument. So initially, the Swedish Jewish organizations, they after Hitler came to power, they mainly tried to help the Jews in Germany by raising funds among Jews in Sweden, and send relief and tried to aid German Jews to emigrate directly to Palestine from Germany, or to another country where they had a better chance of getting a permanent visa. So they sort of calculated with the Swedish government's restrictive policy. But the leaders of the Jewish community of Stockholm, Ehrenpreis and Josefsson, they also negotiated for small concessions to this policy. They opened a boarding school in the south of Sweden, which was run by two German Jewish scientists who managed to save around 170 German Jewish children that way. The image here that you see to the left is from a collection of photos from that school. There was also a quota for 300 Holocaust as German Jewish youth pioneers who did their Auslandshachschara in Sweden. So they worked on Swedish farms in order to get the experience needed to qualify for an immigration certificate to Palestine. In 1938, they also managed to get a small Kindertransport quota for 500 children and a so-called transmigrant quota for around 140 adult refugees. And they were all given temporary residence permits while waiting for further immigration. So that was sort of the government's requirement that this would only be temporary residence, and they would need to move on to another country in 1.5 to 2 years was the initial plan. But as they didn't send anyone back to Germany once the war had started, these refugees stayed on in Sweden. To the right here, you see an application for a residence permit that the Jewish community of Stockholm made for a young medical doctor called Fanny Davidsson from Berlin. She had been working for the Reichsvertretung der Juden in Deutschland, the central administration for Jews in Germany, and several other Jewish organizations in Berlin. And she had been accompanying Kindertransport to Sweden. So she had been with the children, bringing them from Berlin on trains to Sweden, and staying for a few nights, and then go back with a train to Berlin. So in 1939, the Jewish community in Stockholm tried to get a permit for her to stay in Sweden. So Gunnar Josefsson, the chairman of the community, and two well-known physicians, they put up a guarantee for her. But as you can see in this document, it says "Agrad" on stamp at the bottom, which means denied. So it says that not less than 3 times there. So the refugees were generally not allowed to work either, and there was no government support. So they were generally supported by the Jewish community, which produced a special tax on all the congregants and also raised funds through private donations from their members. And they also had fundraising drives, events, concerts, theaters, fundraising bazaars, opera nights, and they also received some help from American Jewish organizations, the JDC and HIAS. So when the Second World War broke out, immigration to Sweden got even harder because Sweden introduced a visa requirement for all foreigners. And it was the same around the world, so it was really difficult for German Jews to get out of Germany. And by that time, between around 4,000 Jews had made it to Sweden. Between 3,500 and 4,000 had made it to Sweden, and many of them had already left by then to a third country. So it was a pretty small number. But it was with the deportation of the Norwegian Jews in November 1942 that public opinion in Sweden shifted towards helping Jews. So people were upset that fellow Scandinavian citizens were deported, and this was also at around the same time as more detailed information about the Holocaust became known in Sweden. So the Swedish government admitted those Jewish refugees that made it over the border from Norway to Sweden. And more than half of Norway's Jews made it over. So in total, there were 2,100, 773, I think, was deported. And around 1,200 made it over to Sweden. And a year later, when the Danish Jews were threatened with deportation, the Swedish government made a declaration that all who made it over the Sound to Sweden would be allowed to stay. So they did it beforehand. And as most of you know, almost the entire Danish Jewish population, more than 700 people, managed to escape over the Sound. So this has been described as a miracle. And on the photo here, you can see one of the small boats that carried Danish Jews over the Sound between Denmark and Sweden. So the Swedish government received a lot of praise for admitting the Danish Jews and the Norwegian Jews, and they also realized that this was a potential way to get goodwill in the eyes of the Allies, since it had been neutral throughout the war. And in 1943 and 44, Jewish organizations in Sweden and elsewhere discussed, what more can we do to help the Jews in Europe. Emigration was impossible. Since October 1941. There was this emigration ban in all of Nazi-controlled Europe. They had been sending food and medicine from Sweden to ghettos in Poland in 1941 and 42. And now they tried to send it to Nazi camps. But there was this general export ban on food from Sweden. So before they had raised the funds in Sweden, and then they wired the money to Portugal, and in Portugal they bought the goods, and it was transported on railways through Europe to Polish ghettos. But with time, there was this blockade by the Allies through France that made this impossible as well. So it was very difficult to do anything, really. And in 1944, a German Jewish businessman in exile called Fritz Hollander and Hechaluz Storch, who you see on the photo here. He was a Latvian Jewish businessman, also in Stockholm since 1940. They tried to save people first from the Baltic countries, but they Now in 1944, they began trying to persuade Swedish authorities to let them send food directly from Sweden to get a concession from this, the export ban. And finally, in the autumn of 1944, they succeeded and were permitted to send hundreds of thousands of food packages to Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen, and Ravensbrück concentration camps. So this was at the time when people were dying of starvation and diseases there, diseases caused by malnutrition in the camps at the end of the war. And we know from testimonies that some of these packages reached the recipients, and many have said that they survived thanks to these packages. And at the very end of the war, Hechaluz was also involved in the effort to include Jewish prisoners in the Swedish Red Cross operation with the white buses in the spring of 1945. So with Himmler's personal masseuse, Felix Kersten, as an intermediator, he negotiated with Himmler about letting Jews be liberated and allowed to be evacuated with the Swedish Red Cross to Sweden. So the purpose of the Swedish Red Cross mission was not to rescue Jews, but to evacuate Scandinavian citizens at the end of the war, in the chaos at the end of the war. So Storch's idea was to get Jewish prisoners to be included in this operation. So as part of these negotiations, Norbert Masur, who you see on the photo here, was another German Jewish exile in Stockholm. He traveled to Germany without any legal documents to meet Himmler on Himmler's on his estate outside of Berlin on the 21st of April 1945 to negotiate directly with Himmler. And Himmler had just come from Hitler's birthday celebration and was tired. And these negotiations, these talks with Masur, they lasted all night. And in the morning, after, the Swedish vice chairman of the Red Cross, Count Bernadotte, arrived and continued the negotiations. And these would lead to that some 3,000 Jews were to be included in the Swedish Red Cross mission with white buses. And in the summer of 1945, after an agreement between the Swedish state and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, Sweden agreed to admit 10,000 so-called displaced persons, DPs, of whom 9,000 were Jews. So around 12,000 in total. So while these operations were humanitarian in nature, diplomatic interests, like repairing Sweden's international image, also played a role. Other countries had suffered destruction and losses, but Sweden had been neutral throughout the war. Its industry was intact, and it had continued to trade with both sides throughout the war. It also had been given concessions to Germany. So it was in need of goodwill. Jewish representatives were also lobbying on the Swedish government to intervene on behalf of the Jews during the war. And already in 1942, they started to plan for post-war relief, forming an informal committee and involving leading politicians and civil society leaders, including the Red Cross head, Folke Bernadotte, Count Bernadotte, who came to lead the Red Cross mission, and several leading social democratic politicians. So there was both internal and external pressure, and this need for goodwill that contributed to this shift in policy. Most of the survivors who arrived in Sweden through the UNRWA transports in the 1945 came to Sweden via Lübeck, where they were washed, disinfected, and registered before being shipped across to Sweden on special civilian vessels that had been chartered and fitted for the task. For some, these procedures, especially the disinfection and being required to undress and being showered, evoke painful reminders of their horrific experiences in the German camps. In Lübeck, there were instances where the British and the Swedish staff acted roughly, and at least one patient died during the bathing process after being scrubbed, despite suffering from severe typhus. In the Swedish ports, tent stations were established where the patients, as they were now called, were examined by doctors, registered once again by the Swedish authorities. Jewish organizations were often present here as well, with social workers and other volunteers who made initial contacts and also created card indexes. And this was a crucial thing for tracing relatives and providing assistance. So the state agencies, they had these indexes for administration, and the Jewish organizations for relief and assistance. And the Jewish organizations then resumed contact with the survivors at the next stage of their journey, which was refugee centers and hospitals. And the survivors were transferred there by buses or ambulances, depending on their needs. And this photograph is from one of the Stockholm harbors. And from there, they were taken to an emergency hospital that had been set up outside of Stockholm in Tuna. The most acute cases were brought direct to hospital in the city. Those who were not taken directly to medical facilities were placed in quarantine camps where they also received medical care. Trauma care was really in its infancy at this time. There were pioneers in psychological and psychiatric treatment in this field, and some of them worked specifically with the survivors, but they were really exceptions. More often, survivors were encouraged to look ahead, build a new life rather than to process their experiences. Um, yeah. And those who were not taken directly to medical facilities were placed in quarantine camps, where they also received medical care. I think I said that right. And one of the most important steps in the process was, as I mentioned, to reunite the survivors with any surviving family members. Um, the Jewish community and other Jewish organizations, mainly the Swedish section of World Jewish Congress, played a crucial role by organizing tracing services. So they published lists of names in special periodicals and newspapers for refugees and survivors. And they sent lists to other tracing services like the ITS, the International Tracing Service, and to the Red Cross Tracing Service and World Jewish Congress, different tracing services. And they broadcasted inquiries over the radio that could be picked up as far away as in South Africa and Palestine. Uh, and this, of course, was profoundly important for the process of rehabilitation. Uh, for a great many, however, the tracing efforts led to the devastating confirmation that all or most of their family had been murdered. Others could search for years or even decades without ever receiving an answer. And as I mentioned, the survivors came from all over Europe, but most were from the Eastern European countries. Many were young women who had survived by being selected labor. But there were also other groups. There were many Dutch, Belgian, and French women, Scandinavians, Italian Jews, Greek Jews, and there were also children and men, of course, and even a few elderly survivors. Um, so initially, they were housed in quarantine camps, as I mentioned, in hospitals, refugee centers, and with time, collective homes, and as they integrated in Swedish society in their own homes. Jewish organizations provided food, clothing, and cultural and religious materials like prayer books and matzah for Passover and so on. They created 13 Jewish boarding schools, several convalescent homes, were run by the Jewish communities and the World Jewish Congress, and the tracing services that I mentioned. And from the Swedish government side, there was not much, as I mentioned, no real trauma care. The survivors were expected to become self-sufficient. They were assisted in finding employment. The Jewish community of Stockholm supported them by providing stipends for vocational training and education. Especially in fields like mechanics, nursing, textile work. And they also intervened when survivors were exploited, which happened, especially in the beginning, in the summer of 1945 already. Jewish survivors were more or less forced to work in agriculture in the south of Sweden, in the beet fields, in the beet harvest. So this image shows women survivors working at a textile factory in Borås, in the southwest of Sweden. But it could just as well be in Norrköping in central Sweden, or in another part of Sweden. So a lot of the survivors worked with these kind of industries. And these were often located in small towns across the country. But with time, those who stayed on often tended to move to the larger cities with a larger Jewish population. Many were quick to form new families. Many married other survivors, but there was also this fear of being forced to go back. The Swedish government from the beginning called them repatriandi. They were repatriates. The intention was that they would be here for a few months to rehabilitate and then return to their home countries. But as I mentioned, those who came from Eastern Europe, they didn't want to go back. They were afraid. So quite a lot of the Eastern European young women married Swedish men, especially in the small towns where they were working. But as I mentioned, many married other survivors or refugees and local Jews as well. So this photograph is of a group of couples celebrating their wedding outside of the Stockholm synagogue in 1946, I think. With the rabbi Emil Kronheim and the cantor Edie Bornstein in the back. And this image shows a meeting of the pioneer organization Hechaluz, whose purpose was to prepare the young people for life in kibbutzim in Eretz Israel, and their a lot of the young people joined this organization in Sweden in the summer of 45. to prepare for Aliyah. So they prepared by studying Hebrew, by learning various trades that will be useful there. There was also military training in Sweden for them to be able to join Haganah once in Palestine. So a lot of the survivors who found anyone in their family or a relative who had survived went to reunite with them somewhere, and those who didn't have anyone tended to be more inclined to emigrate to Palestine and Israel. So in addition to the initial aid given by the Swedish state, which was the sort of the first aid, the care, and the aid that they were provided by the Jewish communities, they also received to a varying degree additional aid from their home countries. But all countries did not take equal responsibilities for their citizens. All European countries had legations or at least consulates in Sweden, and most offered some additional aid. Most Western European countries helped their citizens to return to their home countries, and they gave additional pocket money, food aid, but Romania, Poland, the Soviet Union did very little or nothing for their citizens. In this photo, we see the so-called Phillips Group on a boat trip in Gothenburg, organized by the Phillips Company. So the Phillips Group were women who had survived through slave labor at the Westerbork camp. They were slave workers at the Phillips factory there, set up by the SS in the Westerbork camp in the Netherlands. So when they came to Sweden, they received additional aid by the Netherlands and by the Phillips Company, and they were brought back by airplane as soon as they were healthy enough and got extra money, extra clothes, etc. So not everyone received the same aid. And what kind of aid you received also depended on what organization organized the aid that you were given. So depending on if you were in a collective home organized by the World Jewish Congress or the Vad Hatzalah or the Orthodox organization or the liberal Jewish community or by the Red Cross or some non-sectarian organization, you received sort of a different treatment. So in some homes you would get kosher meals, in some you would have Hebrew and manual Hebrew training and manual work training, vocational training in order to prepare for immigration to Israel. While in a camp or a collective home organized by the liberal Jewish community, you would get Swedish lessons and maybe preparation for higher education because they thought you would want to stay on in Sweden. So it depended on who was in charge of the facility that you were in. Yeah, I mentioned this. So the British maintained strict restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. So all immigration, or almost all immigration, was considered illegal and was carried out through an organization called Aliyah Bet. Aliyah Bet also organized immigration from. So this ship in the photograph here is the SS Ulua. It departed from Trelleborg in the south of Sweden on the 24th of February 1947 with 1,378 surviving Jews as passengers. And most had come to Sweden from Bergen-Belsen and were now on their way to Palestine. In the Mediterranean, the ship was pursued by the Royal Navy until it was finally run aground just south of Haifa. And the crew and the passengers were seized by the British and deported to Cyprus. So this is really a parallel story to the famous ship Eris, which Leon Uris wrote his novel about, and which has also been filmed. The story of the Exodus, and there were several, not as spectacular, but several of these illegal immigration schemes from Sweden with survivors to Palestine, and of course from the creation of Israel. There was open and organized immigration to Israel. In total, around 7,000 refugees and survivors stayed in Sweden. So this number was almost exactly the same as the Jewish population of Sweden had been before the war, about 7,000. As a result, the composition and the character of the Jewish community changed in many ways. The survivors revitalized Jewish life and Jewish identity in Sweden. Linguistically and culturally, they brought roots in Jewish culture. Religiously, they contributed to a shift from a community that had been relatively secular and liberal or reform-oriented toward one with a greater traditional presence. Over time, many of the survivors became integrated into the Jewish congregations. And a significant portion of today's Jewish population in Sweden traces its background, at least in part, to this group that came in 1945. And later groups also arrived from Hungary in 1956, of course, from Poland following the anti-Semitic campaigns of 1968 and 69, and from the Soviet Union in the 1990s. But for all these groups as well, the Holocaust remains part of the collective memory. yeah, I think I will stop there so we have time to you'll have time to ask questions.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. And I'm gonna just take your screen down actually during
Thank you.
Q&A. If anybody would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. The first question is about the Swedish kinder transport, where you mentioned 500 children were rescued. Can you please elaborate on this and who was responsible for that?
Yeah. So this was uh, um, an initiative by the Jewish community of Stockholm. The chairman of the community and the rabbi, Aaron Price, made calls on the government, on leading politicians and on the authorities, the immigration authorities, the National Board of Welfare and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. It was they actually started negotiating for this right before the November pogroms of 1938, but they only received the admission to bring 500 children to Sweden after the pogrom, and the children were selected by German Jewish organizations, and they were transported in groups in 1939, mostly to Sweden by train and ferry, and with, as I mentioned, a Transportbegleitung, an adult person who accompanied the group to Sweden and returned on the next train to Berlin. And they were placed in foster homes as far as possible, in Jewish homes, but also in Gentile homes. And there was also orphanages, a few orphanages set up by the local Jewish communities in Sweden, in Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. And these were the children were only given permits on they were Jewish communities had to guarantee that they were to continue on to another country to reunite with their parents as soon as they could, and that the Jewish community would guarantee that they would not become public charges. So that was sort of the conditions, and and another thing was that their parents were not allowed to apply for residency in Sweden. So what happened later was that when their parents were threatened with deportation, the children often tried to help their parents to Sweden, and the authorities declined and said, no, you were given permission on the condition that your parents wouldn't come. So even in 1944, parents were denied visas to Sweden. Yeah.
Thank you. Were there any support groups that formed for Holocaust survivors throughout the 60s and 70s at the same time that we see a lot of these groups forming in other countries?
I mean, there were not really, I mean, there were self-help groups and survivor groups. Uh, I don't know of any support groups in the Swedish society in the 1960s and 70s. No.
You
but it's
mentioned
an
a little,
interesting
oh,
question.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit about the integration with the survivors who settled in Sweden with the already existing Jewish community in Sweden. What was that like throughout the decades after and the years after the Holocaust? And for the survivors and their children, eventually, what is the role that the Jewish community, that the survivor community and their descendants have played in Sweden's current Jewish community?
I'm very sorry. I missed the first part of your question.
Oh, sorry. The question was about the integration with the
Yeah.
survivors who and their role with the existing Jewish community in Sweden that had been there before the war years, and then the survivors from other countries like Eastern Europe who settled in Sweden. And just in terms of the integration and the cultural differences, maybe, and how they ended up working with each other to basically build this
Yeah.
Jewish community.
Yeah. It's complicated and it varied. It varied a lot. Uh, Partly depending on where you came and what context you had been in when you came in 1945. And there was this tendency uh, among the refugees and survivors to form groups and organizations within their own community too. And and there was this feeling that the local Jewish communities were not doing as much as they could to integrate them. So so there was this sort of feeling of disappointment often towards the local Jewish communities, and it's important to know that membership in a in a religious community until 1951 was compulsory in Sweden. So all Swedish Jews were part of the local Jewish communities. They had to be and paid taxes to their Jewish communities. And the survivors were generally not part of this community because you had to be a citizen uh, to be a member of the community. Uh, so they, of course, felt excluded, and although they received material aid from the Jewish communities, they didn't feel that they were included, really. Um, But there were exceptions that many were integrated and into the communities and became important functionaries in the different committees and organizations and the communal life. And but um, yeah, it varied a lot. And so in the early years, the survivors were scattered all over Sweden, and it was only in a few years that they began to move to the larger cities and really have the opportunity to integrate too. Um, but I think also that it's a difficult question because the survivors also expected something that was really hard for the local Jewish communities to provide. I mean, they had lost everything, and there was really it was really nothing that the local Jewish communities could make up for in any way. So yeah. It's a complicated and difficult question.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier about the female refugees being subjected to the disinfectant, and was there a were the men a part of that as well at the same time, and were they watching? The question here is about the humiliation that the female survivors might have felt with that around other men. Would that be in the same place together?
Uh, like it was not only the women. Everyone was subjected to this, and not only Jewish survivors. There were also survivors from concentration camps, non-Jewish survivors. Uh, I'm actually not sure if they were mixed. I can't remember, but the personnel, the staff was surveying it, I think was uh, um, a larger source of humiliation maybe than fellow patients.
Thank you. And did most survivors become citizens eventually?
Those that stayed on for more than 7 or 10 years became citizens. Yes, uh, most of them. Yes, so you were naturalized after a certain time, or if you were married to a Swedish citizen.
Thank you. What is the role of Holocaust education in the Swedish schools today? Is this something that's part of the curriculum that during in school?
Yes, it's actually mentioned for in the curriculums in for I think it has been for a few years, but it's often taught in our equivalents to high school and there are courses, of course, in that you can take in university. But yeah, it's part of the curriculum. It is, but it's of course quite brief and um, not really in depth, but it's there.
To conclude, do you have a sense of how many survivors are still in Sweden today?
Oh, the first generation. No, I don't know actually. It's I know a handful, but I don't really know. I don't think anyone knows, but at least a handful.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And I also wanted to just acknowledge that Ava Bretler, who is a survivor in our community here in Los Angeles, was listening to this Zoom today, and she lived in Sweden for a couple of years after liberation, and she was from Transylvania. So I want to just acknowledge her today. And again, thank you so much for sharing your research. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And we hope you join our next session, which will be February 19th at 4 o'clock p.m. Pacific time, which will be on Australia. And wishing everyone a good day ahead. And again, please follow our website for more information on our virtual programs and wishing wishing you a good rest of the year. And thank you again so much to Professor Rudberg for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.